Thanks so much for joining us, y'all, at the Project Censored Radio Show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Libertie Valance and Cindy Barukh Milstein. Libertie grew up in Southern Appalachia and is a founding member of the Firestorm Collective in Asheville, North Carolina. They've been involved in radical projects from open source software to mass mobilizations for nearly 25 years. At Firestorm, their current focus is on coordinating and facilitating community events. Cindy Barukh Milstein is a diasporic queer Jewish anarchist and longtime organizer, especially of do-it-ourselves spaces and imaginative alternatives. They've authored and edited numerous books, ranging from Try Anarchism for Life to Rebellious Mourning and the forthcoming Constellations of Care, Anarcha-Feminism in Practice. Thanks both for joining us so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks.
So, Firestorm, for those listening who have not had the privilege of being there, is a rad co-op bookstore in Asheville, North Carolina. It's not a huge operation, and it's certainly not like a chain of bookstores, and yet y'all came to be the keepers of more than 22,000 books, which include some 47 titles banned by the Duval County Public School System in Florida, a school system where 70% of students are not white and 40% of students are poor. Can you explain how these books came to y'all?
Yeah, do you want me to start off with
Yeah,
them?
yeah,
Okay.
great.
Yeah, so uh pretty pretty weird story. Um there uh isn't really anything we did to make it happen. It was sort of a coincidence. Uh but a contractor who was tasked with removing the books from the school system uh was getting in touch with bookstores apparently in the Southeast looking for a new home for these titles, and not having much luck. And I guess progressively reaching out to bookstores further and further away from Duval County, but kind of specifically like contacting like queer and trans owned bookstores or progressive bookstores. Um, and by the time that he had contacted us, we were told basically like you have a week to make the decision on this. And if you say no, the books are going to be pulped. So it put a lot of pressure on us to say yes. And of course, we were excited about the possibility, just as we were sort of horrified by the implication of all of these books that had been really stolen from kids. And so that was the genesis of the project. From there, there's a lot of brainstorming around what to do with the titles. And it pretty quickly became clear in conversations that we were having, both internally and with friends outside of our collective, including Milstein, that the correct thing to do with these books was to try and get them back to kids in Florida. Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
I'll pause right there.
Yeah. Yeah, we were actually at staying at a mutual friend's house who has another independent anarchist bookstore in the Atlanta area. Didn't at the time, but we were at a book fair. And I remember us were just talking after, hanging around the house after the book fair about Liberty going, oh, we've got these books. I'm not sure we're going to, we have to think of some creative way to think about getting them back. And so we started throwing out ideas. It was really, and I just got more and more excited in both of us seeing the potential, um, out of this horrible situation where, the state that has by far the most amount of book banning that relates to clearly so much, um, you know, horrible legislation and policies and implementation of those policies, such as Duvall getting literally just scared of these titles and deciding they wanted to not accept these huge books, which are basically new. So yeah, we're just thinking of the title, like, what do you do at this moment of like rising fascism and in which book bans are connected to attacks on humans and, you know, people of color, queer people, trans people, a lot of other people. Anyway, long story, we were just sitting around the table and we're like, oh, we started getting like enthused about the ideas of how to make this project get books back to kids in Florida, but also think about connecting it to what's going on in the world right now, specifically in Florida. But anyway, it was just kind of like this conversation, and then I was like, "Oh, I'd love to help with that," but it kind of got delayed because Firestorm was doing another huge project, which was renovating a space and move. So yeah, fast forward to now that um, Firestorm asked if I would help out. It's been great, and we sat around doing a lot of brainstorming, as you mentioned, to come up with this idea of "Ban Books Back" as a title, which is kind of a homage to Bashback, which was queer and trans and other non gender conforming folks who were like, we don't have to take the attacks on us sitting down. We can fight back and resist. And the sort of subtag, which was "trash fascism, not books," to kind of get at the fact that these books would basically be destroyed if they were not sent back to kids' hands in Florida.
Yeah, and we've got some of the books here that we could actually share and show you. Just a few that we grabbed from our samples box. Um, Here's a poetry collection by a Palestinian American author that's targeted at a middle grade audience.
Just relates to another book, a second book on Palestine
Yeah, and
called
this
"A
is kind
Little
of an
Piece of
older
Ground."
title.
Yep.
Yeah. Um, got uh, some copies of The Night Diary, which is actually one of a staff favorite. And then an enormous number of books that are, focused on LGBT, like history or individuals. So here's a book on the Stonewall riots. Another one that was actually already a bit of a staff favorite. Um, Julianne is a Mermaid. Folks may be familiar with. Um, and some books on radical organizing history, like Memphis, Martin, and the Mountaintop on the sanitation workers strike, which, of course, covers the assassination of King in both prose and poetry.
Wow.
So it's a really, it's a range of books, and some of them have content that's very powerful, and some of them have content that's very benign, and it's almost difficult to kind of like guess as to why they were removed.
Yeah. I think that's what's been kind of poignant is we started coming to the conclusion like some of the books you have no idea why they would even be objectionable. And some of them are just kind of basic stories that a lot of people look to fondly and warmly about sort of the history of the United States, like the civil rights movement, so, and because they're written for kids, they're very, I mean, I was looking at one of them yesterday that was talking about desegregation, and it kind of ends with, wow, it's so great to be in a classroom with a whole bunch of other kids who look all different ways together. And that's the end, and we're just like, wow, that simple message that it's okay to be around other people that don't look like you is a threat.
So basically, I mean, I was going to ask about the titles, but it seems like anything that doesn't uplift a a white supremacist, cis, American exceptional perspective is dangerous.
Yeah, it is really striking that so many of these books seem to have been removed simply to erase the identities of the protagonists or the authors. Um, you know, we're a radical bookstore. We stock a wide range of things, including some kids' books that I think are genuinely pretty subversive. A lot of these are books that we would not have ever put on our shelves. Um, uh, they're titles that perhaps aren't written as political or social interventions. They're just simply you know stories that are written for children about other children, whether they're Native American or black or queer. Uh, and it is really, it drives home the point that I think any representation outside of that kind of cis heteronormative, like white supremacist, Christian supremacist identity really don't have a place right now in the Florida school system.
Yeah. Yeah. It looks at, I mean, there's also books about, that I was looking at one the other day too, that was looking at different ways people celebrate their holidays in their own tradition, and whether you're Muslim or Jewish or black or, it was like all these simple, and there's a book that we found a few copies of that's about Ramadan. And so, yeah, even there's a representation, books about folks coming from other places, Southeast Asia, India, and just how they feel about trying to fit in and make friends, kind of just the basic stories, I was really struck by a lot of them are just like, and now I have friends that are different than me. You know? So again, there are very few of these books that are like anywhere near radical or explicitly, um, yeah, explicitly subversive in the way that people might understand, or that the far right might understand when they're like, "Oh, these books are banned for a reason." And you look at them, they're just kind of a lot of them are the warmest and fuzziest of messages. Um, if if you are not someone who's white, cis, Christian, often male, yeah, heteronormative.
But yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking it from a personal perspective. I mean, I'm in Baltimore, and we have a rad bookstore called Red Emma's here, and there's a lot of books, and I take my son there. He's 2, and there's a lot of books that are not. They don't have characters that look like him, but it's like I love these books. They're great. I'm not offended by him reading a book. I mean, he can't read, but like where about indigenous people saying we're water protectors. I'm like, this is such a rad message, and it's so important. It's like, what kind of like absolute monster would I be if I'm like, "That's offensive." Like, what? That's so absurd. But that's the United States. I'm just curious that I was thinking about this when y'all were speaking. I mean, so you got these books from this these folks in Duval County. Are there more on the chop block? Like, is Firestorm now like this beacon of like send your banned books here and they will be redistributed?
Uh, I we don't know if anyone else will do that, but like I said, because we didn't create this opportunity, we just sort of seized on it, and as a result, it's not necessarily something that we can recreate, or it's not a model, it's not Food Not Bombs. We can't be like, "Every city should have a banned books back,"
Yeah.
because, step 1 is acquire thousands of books for free. So, I don't know how we repeat that. Um, uh but, certainly if anybody wanted to send us more books, we would do our best to get them out into the world.
I think the other thing it points to though is, um, and I feel really proud of this about this project is, there are taking situations that are horrible and coming up with an imaginative response to it that highlights, both the contestation of the horrific shifts that are going on this continent, that were already in progress but are worsening, and but also offering people a vision of some other way to relate to each other and to live. And so I really appreciate this project because it's us brainstorming to come up with a creative response that doesn't um, hide the fact that this is connected to attacks on not just books but ultimately people's bodies and lives and cultures. And we do that in a way that is so, for lack of a better term, positive or good news. I mean, I think I've been so struck by just hundreds and hundreds of people that are like, this gives me hope. This makes me feel a sense of promise. We've been especially heartened, like, because everything's gone back to Florida, is people writing and saying, there's so many of us fighting here. Thank you for recognizing that. Thank you for creating this project that's so, such a, yeah, imaginative. I keep coming back to that. And so I think whether it isn't just about Firestorm getting another batch of books and doing something, but it's about everyone who's facing these things, coming up with different other imaginative ways to respond that don't hide um, what they're in reaction to. Like the more we debated a long time about whether how explicit to be about the politics behind this. And I'm really proud that we went with, both warm and fuzzy and being explicit at the same time. And people are really responding to that. I mean, I've really been struck by folks getting these books in Florida or they know what is going on there.
Right.
And we've sent so many books to little libraries, which we could talk about. So many of them were like, oh, I'm already been doing a little library that's focused on banned books, or I've been wanting to, or I want to do it in honor of, you know, um, people that I know don't have the ability to do this. And I want to do it to reach out specifically to marginalized kids, whether they're queer kids or low income kids, migrant refugee kids, kids of color. A lot of people have been very self aware about what they are doing in creative ways to distribute them once we get them into their hands, because they're ultimately the ones doing the very direct work of getting the books back.
Yeah, that's great. Like beautiful, a cluster of beautiful microcosms. So talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about like the workflow of how are you? What is the actual getting banned books back look like?
Yeah, so I guess we're kind of taking a two-pronged approach. One is that we are sending book bundles directly to kids. So we've got an online form that kids and adults can fill out on behalf of a kid in Florida, specifying like an age range, and then that kind of queues people up to receive free books. And we've got a whole workflow for that. And then in parallel to that, we also have been accepting like partner requests where organizations on the ground in Florida can request books. And then, of course, we're sending larger quantities to those folks. Our very first partner organization was folks in the mutual aid disaster relief network, who, of course, have lots of experience distributing grassroots supplies and resources. So they were a natural fit. Um, but since then, we've, additionally partnered with local pride organizations, religious institutions, um, a lot of little free libraries.
Yeah, Food Not Bombs in Jacksonville, which is the county within the county they came from,
Yep.
and they're distributing food and books, which is great,
Right.
freely.
Yeah. So, kind of doing that multi-pronged approach, recognizing that we can send books directly to kids, but that ultimately folks on the ground are going to reach kids that we can't. Um, and I think just, it's sending individual packages is pretty labor intensive. So it's great to be able to take that large quantity of books and kind of split it and do a lower intensity distribution strategy to pass off to some partners while also doing the very kind of intimate work of putting together little boxes for individual children.
Yeah.
And that work has been accomplished so far and will continue at community volunteer packaging days. So, had two so far. We've got a third one that's specifically for youth volunteers. I know we've got an entire Girl Scout troop is coming to help package boxes on next Thursday.
With a very queer, trans, inclusive troop too.
Yep. Yeah, I think folks who really line up well. And that'll be a lot of fun. We've had a few other like young folks participate, but it'll be our first packaging party that's really focused on kids sending books to kids,
Yeah.
which I think is like a really cool
Yep.
like development.
Yeah.
Um, and those packaging parties have been a lot of fun. They look like giving people essentially like a packing list and saying, like each box gets X number of books in whatever format, and then we throw in goodies like every box is getting one of these. I'm a unicorn and I like to fight, a kid's guide to standing up to fascism and bullies from our friends at Attorney and Press.
And they kindly let us print that and distribute it for free. It's something they usually sell.
Yeah, we got our little trash fascism, not books, possum sticker.
Love it.
Oh yeah, here you want to do this one, and then a zine that we wrote that's sort of more oriented towards adults and allies, which is sort of just a short history and explanation of what the Ban Books Back project is.
Yeah.
And then,
Oh, we forgot to grab to show.
Uh-oh.
We have two really brief little half sheets that are
Oh.
critical reading guides.
Mm.
One goes with the picture books, and it's assuming that an adult will probably be sitting with a child
Mhm.
and reading the book. Because we want to I think part of book bans is trying to discourage critical thought, and we were like, oh, we're sending these books. Here's how can we do that around these books and get people to question read them with a sharp eye. And then we have a critical reading guide for kids that goes along with the chapter books packages. And those are the two types of children's books we have. And that we assume a kid's like curling up on their bed on their own or in a chair outside and reading their own book, and that, they can read along with some questions to think critically too. Yeah. And then the last piece,
Yeah, and then we've just got our little, like, hashtag sticker there that we're throwing on the boxes so that when folks receive their boxes, if they want, they can participate in kind of posting a photo on social media about them and hopefully get the word out to more folks.
yeah. And we actually have that's been really sweet to see people with their books, or their kids reading, like after they've gotten them. So there's a connection to see the books, who they're getting to as well. Yeah, I wanted to say about the individual book bundles. They're all people requesting them from us, and we are not sharing the data. I want just people, it's like we're, but and people can choose whether they want to tag themselves later. But I've just so what it's been really beautiful. The packaging parties is um just the enthusiasm for doing this also, and people. One thing we kind of tell people when we're like orienting people to how to pack up a box is there's no rush. We're not in a hurry. Think about this as if you were packaging a gift for a child in your life, and you know put as much like love and care into that. And then during our youth packaging party, we're going to add a little thing to the boxes, which I think is going to be a great idea. We just came up with yesterday, which is this box is packed by, and then have a place for the youth to write their name or draw a little picture, whatever they want, and throw it into the boxes too. Which I will probably use at other packaging parties after this. But
Yeah, but to kind of reinforce the idea that there are people behind this and it's about creating connections across state lines of solidarity.
yeah,
Yeah.
And I think that is something that's been really important to us and something that I think that very first piece of kind of media that we got from Autostraddle
sure.
really hit on, which is that underlying this project is the idea that um, spaces that are under attack and spaces in which fascists have secured a significant amount of power are places that require solidarity and support and not abandonment. And I think it's really easy, uh, particularly I think for liberal folks who are not in the South or not in Florida, to have a somewhat smug attitude about book banning. Um, when the reality is that book bans are happening all over the country,
Yep.
and the phenomena that people are living through and surviving in Florida, it's not unique to Florida, and I think it calls on all of us to really step up our solidarity rather than writing off sections of the country as if they didn't have beautiful queer and BIPOC communities engaged in like daily acts of resistance on the ground. Just because that's not what's in the media, I think it's easy to forget, perhaps, especially for folks who don't have ties to those communities, how vibrant and also how on the front lines these communities are. And when we think about what resistance looks like, I think a lot of times we should be taking cues from these communities rather than assuming that because they are in sort of the hot spot or repression, they don't have something to offer.
Yeah. No, I think that's going to be it's an especially important part of this story, and hopefully we'll write it up someday, which to think about the whole process of this, including the people in Florida who were resisting and fighting, and um, yeah, how what that says for other places across the continent. For the kinds of struggles they might want to imagine. So, as Liberty touched on, it also really like underline this was a great fit for Firestorm. It's serendipitous that the contractor found it, but I also don't think it's an accident that Firestorm said yes, um, because of the values underlying. I mean, that sort of was the first thing is like what values want to be brought up in doing this, as opposed to just kind of a liberal project where like, oh, we're just sending back a thing to something, versus this is about the social relationships of solidarity, mutual aid, forms of direct action and resistance that are also pointing toward different forms of doing things that are um, more reflect the kinds of worlds we want to see. And I feel like we've kept those values in mind the whole way, like the social relational qualities, solidarity. Yeah. And that's, I think, especially important at this time period in human history. It's been really, poignant and hard and sad to be doing this at a time when there's, a genocide going on and when queer, indigenous youth like Nex were
Mhm.
murdered, and we could go on and on about the list of things that feel horrific and are hurting our hearts, and yet here we're able to like send out books in a way that it's just been it really has been striking how many people feel a sense of heart with this project, and we're able to get books back that reflect some of those, you know, different values of how people can treat each other. Even as I was saying earlier, I was like, some of the books are just like, oh, I can have a friend who's trans or a parent who's queer, or be in a classroom with kids of every culture and color and gender and faith. Um, that's a huge message right now in a place in a time period when we're being told that that's something that can get you hurt or killed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what's so powerful there too is like, especially, I mean, you, Cindy, you mentioned the guides. There's like a deschooling or an unschooling aspect to this, where it's like you are circumventing the entire, schooling industrial complex that's trying to erase entire cultures and entire peoples, and you're circumventing that through this project, which I think is so incredibly powerful.
Yeah, we didn't actually mention that, but I maybe I'll just shout out another aspect of this project is to borrow the title of a friend of ours, uh, Carla Bergman's book, Trust Kids. Like youth liberation is another big value underlying this. And yeah, and thank you for pointing out the deschooling and unschooling part of it. That's really I've definitely anecdotally, some folks who've written for some of the book packets or to partner have been like teachers that have had to leave the schools because they can't stand how education's going, or people just talking about how they're like, oh, I couldn't actually have this book wouldn't be allowed, and I'm so glad I can bring this to my child because it wouldn't be allowed in the school, etc.
And there's a particular way I think that we talk about book bans in the United States oftentimes, which I think as anarchists and as anti-fascists we find really inadequate. Uh, so I think the popular discourse around book banning is that it is essentially a struggle between parents and the state, um, or the state agents, whether that's librarians or teachers. And so the liberal narrative is that the state is good and we should trust the state. And parents are being awful. And we need to support our librarians and our teachers in a fight against, you know, on the front lines in this fight against these very reactionary parents groups. And I think what's missing from that, of course, is the actual kids. So like, um, and understanding that it is true that there are a lot of small-minded parents in the world. There's also a lot of incredible parents, and similarly, there are, incredible librarians, incredible teachers, and there's many people who have had the experience of being excluded, marginalized, or gatekept by those institutions as well. And ultimately, what liberation looks like is trusting kids and finding ways to include kids in the process of their own liberation, and that's a thing that is a little tricky, especially when you're an adult who doesn't have kids in your life, in your home or those direct care relationships. But it's something that's really important to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious. I mean, you mentioned the Girl Scouts coming, but what has been the response from youth, like either in your community or youth that have heard about this going on? What has been some of the response from kids who might also be wanting to read these books or have read these books?
Yeah. So this upcoming Thursday youth packaging party will be our first
Yeah.
explicitly like youth oriented packaging party. And so in some ways, this is a little TBD. Um, you know, of the younger books who have participated, there's been a lot of enthusiasm. We haven't had um, kind of like preteens or like much younger folks involved yet on this end of things. And of course, a lot of the feedback that we're getting is being kind of mediated by families and parents and other adults in kids' lives in terms of kids in Florida who are receiving the books. But I think just more generally, as a bookstore, I can say that we see kids every day have their kind of like worlds blown open by access to books. And a book, especially for a slightly older kid, a book is a really powerful thing because it's a space for a kid to explore an idea unmediated by the adults in that kid's life. And I think that's both what makes books so scary to the far right because it circumvents the power structure that kind of the entire like Christian nationalist world is built on, the idea of the nuclear family. Um, and at the same time, I think makes it so liberatory and exciting for our youth and their allies. And I think there's interesting dynamics there. I think about books that kids have really been enthused about, and a lot of times they are books that are maybe right on the edge there of being like forbidden knowledge. Like there's a book we stock named "Sex is a Funny Word," and it's like kind of like a like bodies, like it's a little it's kind of a it's a sex ed book that, it's not about sex per se, it's about all the other things related to kind of like bodies and boundaries and, and crushes and all of this stuff. And it's written in a very inclusive way. It's actually a author illustrator duo who we adore. And I remember when we first got this book, within a week or so of putting it on the shelves, I had the experience of watching a group of maybe 11 or 12-year-olds come into the bookstore and find this book and then just glom onto it. Like these kids just got in a little circle and huddled on the floor and were reading it together, like it was the most exciting thing they had ever found. And, the adults in their lives who brought them there were of course tickled, because they had brought them to the anarchist bookstore. So they weren't trying to avoid having their kids learn any of these things. Um, but it was a really magical experience. And I think an interesting thing though is that we also can see the way in which kids are being trained to be gatekeepers um, for themselves and for others, and to kind of reinforce regimes of censorship. So this same book, interestingly, we have taken to some school book fairs. And Firestorm, before 2020, when we uh, posted a lot about the police, we used to get invited to do book fairs in the public school system. Um, so there was a window of 2 or 3 years where the anarchist bookstore was the official vendor and creator of school book fairs for a couple schools in Asheville, North Carolina, which is pretty great. And we brought cool stuff, and I think parents and kids really all appreciated it a lot. But I do remember that same book, "Sex is a Funny Word," was one of the ones that we took to a local elementary school. And I remember halfway through the day there was a kid who sort of self-appointed as a book cop, and started telling other kids that they should not look at this book, that it was inappropriate for them to. And mind you, these are kids who are the correct age for this book, right? This is a book that for 8 to 13-year-old, and this is a 10-year-old telling other 10-year-olds like you're not allowed to read this, it's not appropriate. And it really, I think we laughed about it, but we also were like, wow, it's amazing how aggressively the drive to restrict knowledge and censor like your peers is drilled into kids, even at a young age. And here was a kid who didn't really know what the content of the book was, hadn't read, similar to similar to the people who are banning all of these books in Florida. They may not even know what's really in the book. Um, But it is fascinating the way that society imprints that onto young people.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah, I
to
mean,
your
they're
point at the
rewarded.
beginning, to your point at the beginning, Eleanor, where you're like, you take your child into Red Emma's, and it's just all even just the fact that children's books now have such a vast array of the whole of humanity, um, represented on pages of books. Uh, yeah, I feel like sometimes we don't necessarily know because parents don't want their kids to be posting or sharing stories. They want to do it for them. So you don't necessarily know directly what kids think. But I also have just been really struck by at Firestorm, like watching people who come in, parents and some friends of mine who are grandparents who came in and they were just like, we know we can come into this space. And even if we don't know the right book to get for our kids. We know that any book we pick here will help to open up their minds to
Hmm.
whole different parts of, humanity. Um, yeah, I think that's a big deal right now too, is to not, I was really struck by that couple looking for books because they were like, we don't have to, we can trust in, you know, anarchist or feminist queer bookstores, and the authors that are creating those books. Um, and then trust the kids we give them to. That really struck me, you know, to do that. And maybe to come back to that, what Liberty was just talking about, that kind of real powerful dichotomy of how young kids take on the values of the society they're in, which I think it's why so important. Books that seem almost innocuous sometimes, um, but then show kids that they can, think for themselves or pick their own friends.
Fight back against
Yeah.
fascism.
Yeah. But even the most, I think that's really huge because a book is so different than social media where you open it up and words allow your mind to create your own pictures and to think with it and through it and imagine something different. And right now in human history, we really need to be imagining a lot of things differently. And
And kids are really good at that
yeah,
when they're not being told to shut that down.
yeah, yeah,
Right. And of course, they're rewarded for that, cop behavior. Like, I'm sure he got big high fives or a lot of gratitude from teachers or parents that were like, that was so good that you shut people away from that
yeah.
book. It's like,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
it becomes the reward system for sure. Um, so kind of wrapping up here, I mean, obviously this, as you pointed out, this is a unique situation, but it's also, of course, not in the sense that books are being banned across the country, and even where they're not being banned, just simple the access to those books, even if they're not officially banned, can sometimes be very restrictive. What do you feel as a radical bookstore? What do you feel that other bookstores could do to circumvent these bans? Or not even bookstores, but as you mentioned, like little libraries. What can folks in communities do to combat the banning of books?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different ways. I would hope that, again, I really want to encourage people to sit down with a few people in their face to face relationships, whether they're a bookstore, a little library, event space, and just dream up all sorts of interesting, innovative ways to do that. Some of the ones we've heard about are, as I mentioned, like various little libraries are curating their little libraries to be specifically books that are banned. But, you could go farther than that. And, folks doing that with little libraries could, you know, do little community gatherings around them and talk about the books or put together like we did a zine describing through their lens why they think it's important. I know a lot of radical anarchist indie bookstores always are doing events, face to face and virtual events, is using those events to highlight the importance of ideas and critical thought and pointing to some of the books that are banned as part of that. But I think it's bigger than just the books. It's like connecting again, which books seem to be the target. Unfortunately, in the United States, if you look at the list of books that are banned, right, it's in the thousands. And they're the whole range of things. So again, uh, you know, yeah, it isn't it you could probably go to most bookstores and you would see banned books there. So I think it's contextualizing um the political climate at the same time. Someone has I think Connect had mentioned to us and contacted that they were thinking of starting a bookstore in Jacksonville, Florida. This um, just would sell banned books. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think. And also, someone contacted, reached out and said they're in a completely different region of the United States, and they were also were like, "Oh, I think there's been books being pulled off shelves in the school district I'm in. I'm going to look into it. And if I do, could we talk to you about trying to do a project similarly where we are?" So, people could go into their own communities and try to figure out what's happening to books that seem to be disappearing and potentially do some creative projects. So I just feel like there's so many different ways to begin to reimagine um, what it would look like to to do this and tie it to the actual harm that's happening to people because people want, there's the history, if you look up the history, take 5 minutes if you're interested and just anyway, search if anyone searches like the history of book banning. Books have been banned since pretty much the beginning of time of there being books. Whenever there's been any kind of authoritarian, fascist, dictator, any kind of regime that wants to control people, around a single, valued cluster of identity. They always have banned books. They burn books. They burn libraries. We see that right now in Gaza, archives, libraries. That is nothing new, sadly. Um,
And they don't ever stop there.
yeah, and that's the other lesson you get when you look, even if for 5 minutes, it never stops. So people point to, oh, the Nazis burned books in 1933, and look what that led to. And that, and those books happened to be from a queer archive that was at the forefront of, gay and homosexual space, and queer and trans, like different language at that time. But
Yeah.
those were, you know, queer and trans books that were burned by Nazis in public in giant bonfires. And people point to that as the only time that's ever happened. And that was a horrific, egregious moment. And horrors came out of that moment. But you see that repeatedly through history. So yeah, so us intervening on this level of, we can stop. You think, oh, it isn't just the book bans, but actually turning back the tide on book bans can have the opposite effect, which is what I wanted to get at. It keeps people's minds open. It keeps people feeling like they can resist and rebel and ask for and create their own better world in the here and now. And I think so. I think there's something really important about these book bans right now. If you look at the United States, it's astonishing in the last couple of years how many books have been banned. And if you see the shifts in, the culture and the politics, it goes hand in hand.
And in terms of bookstores, I think, obviously there's a lot of bookstores who are like, oh, we're gonna make banned books displays, we're gonna sell these books that have been banned. And I think that's fine, but I think it's ultimately not a particularly compelling form of resistance to sort of it's a sort of neoliberal approach to book banning to be like, we're gonna make these books available to anyone who can pay for them. So ultimately, I think the thing that bookstores can offer that's more powerful than selling banned books, which of course is good and fine, um, is to create space and to build community and that sense of solidarity. And I know for a lot of like queer and marginalized kids, like access to libraries and bookstores is so crucial to having like that sense of like a safe space to explore and to like not feel judged and feel welcome. And I think bookstores can offer that. Um, and can also, be involved in creating, patterns of resistance and community relationships and things like that.
Yeah.
I like have historically not been particularly interested in little free libraries. And when we first started getting contacted by little free libraries, I rolled my eyes a lot about it. Because my experience with little free libraries previously was that they often exist in affluent neighborhoods and that they exist sometimes almost as sort of a bit of a like a status project or something, sort of like, oh, look how liberal and open-minded we are, like how much we love to read. We have like this little underutilized like birdhouse that's been built for books. Um, and it felt very like kind of almost like I don't know, like a cultural, like whatever. And so it took me a minute to come around to the idea of like sending a lot of these books to little free libraries. But I think what we've learned is that there are people who are taking that idea of the little free library and doing something really rad with it. And in some ways, it is actually kind of brilliant because deployed in the right way in the right space, a little free library is this sort of unmediated intervention into book access at the neighborhood level. And so when we started to realize that a lot of these little free libraries are actually located in like low income neighborhoods and in like very accessible spaces, like near parks and like on public streets where kids are walking and
We're next to school. A lot of them were like, we're near the school.
right. And like at that point, it starts to shift a little bit, and you're like, "Oh, this isn't just like a status project from affluent white people in the suburbs. This is like actually like a really shrewd like mechanism of like reaching and supporting like readers and young folks."
Yeah.
And that's been fun to see, and maybe it's also a good reminder that everything is so contextual. So a form of resistance that looks very passe in one space actually has so much potential in another.
Yeah. And I guess other thing I want to add to this is, we were really committed. These books were gifted to us freely, and we're like, we're going to get them back to people freely.
Mm.
And so have done a lot of fundraising to make that happen through hundreds and hundreds of people and seeing the value of this. But everything's been sent to people for free. And just also the astonishment of everyone we've gotten a lot of people writing back going, wow, I didn't understand you were sending new books. These books are so wonderful. And so people who might not have been able to afford, I mean, kids' books, $15, $20. And if you send 5 or 6 of hardback books or a mix of paper and hardback, it's a pretty substantial gift that a lot of people might not be able to afford. But I know a lot of other bookstores and publishers are coming up with creative ways. Obviously they need to survive. They're still under it, until capitalism is gone, they're still need to survive. But a lot of publishers and bookstores have offered up, PDFs of books at different critical moments. During the George Floyd uprising, or right now with what's happening in Gaza, or other ways I think Liberty is mentioning is to not just think about it as a thing to sell in a space,
Right.
but what ways can we gift each other the ability to think and act critically, and creating space for people just to be together. I've really, really been struck, whether it's during the book packaging parties or a game night at Firestorm or an art making session, and you know all sorts in solidarity with Palestinians, or I'm trying to think, Phil, everything that happens here, conversation about anarchism for people that didn't know anything about it. In all those spaces, I've been really struck by, folks who come in who are, Asheville's pretty homogeneous in a lot of ways, but you really do see more of definitely more queer, trans, a little bit more people of color here than in other spaces, even though Asheville's very, but also more like Muslim, Jewish, etc. people here. And I've really been struck by people over and over again in these spaces saying, it feels so different. I feel so safe. I feel so comfortable here. I feel so seen. Can I stay and read a book
Mm.
after this event?
Of
And
course.
and of course, and Firestorm said, of course, So yeah, how to make spaces that aren't simply about, you're walking in. Firestorm is a bookstore that sells things. It needs to make a certain amount of money and continually makes decisions that also defy that. And those decisions actually make people want to come here more, not as a marketing tool, but because they're like, I can feel whole here. I can feel parts of myself that don't get seen other places. I can think critically and talk to others critically about the world. So yeah, I think those are part of fighting book bans as well, even though we don't see it as direct.
Yeah, that's incredibly powerful, the continuous circumventing of oppressive systems while building something really beautiful. So, thank y'all so much for taking the time to sit down with us. Where can folks find out more about this project and about Firestorm in general?
Yeah, so the best place to look for that information is going to be our website or our social media accounts. Our website is just firestorm.coop. That's .coop. It's short for cooperative. And if you want to go directly to information about the Banned Books Project, you can just throw / and banned books with no punctuation onto that address. And then we're Firestorm Co-op on most social media, particularly active on Instagram.
Awesome.
And if
Well,
people are in Asheville coming through or in town,
There's a physical
there's
space.
a beautiful physical space to come by to.
yeah, well, I look forward to checking out the new space. I have not been able to see it yet, so I'm
Please
hopefully
do.
I
Well,
will.
the dates for the Asheville kind of based anarchist book fair, another Carolina anarchist book fair just got announced. It's going to be at the end of June. So if you or anyone else is looking for a great time to come to Asheville, I think the tail end of June is going to be a really incredible weekend full of lots of great activism and organizing and literature and gathering spaces.
Sweet. Okay. Well, I will definitely keep an eye out for that. Thanks y'all again so much for
Thank you.
taking the time to sit down with me.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Awesome.